So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Gita Hariharan's short story, The Remains of the Feast, which happens to be the final text for this particular course. Now, we've already had a lecture on this, and we talked about the fundamental features, the main issues in the story that we were covering, which is about agency and the location of the female in a particular space, in this case, a household space. And of course, the cultural setting is very, very important. So, the family we're talking about over here is a Tamil Brahmin family, and which is vegetarian, who have vegetarian food. So food becomes a very important marker of identity, which will later become a marker of subversion in this particular story, as we will see in due course. The whole idea, the whole issue about hygiene, morality, and morality associated with consumption of certain kind of food, those become very, very important issues in this particular story. And this very old widow, Rukmini, who happens to be the protagonist, or not perhaps the protagonist, but one of the two protagonists in the story, she enacts this act of subversion through a certain kind of consumption, which is not hygienic, not morally sanctioned as per the parameters of this particular family. And the other protagonist, who's the one who's narrating the story, we told that she's training to be a doctor, and the Rukmini happens to be her great-grandmother. And there is some degree of empathetic connect between these two characters because she is aspiring to be a doctor, and she's on a cusp of womanhood. She's someone who's about to become a woman, whereas Rukmini is someone who's about to become a child from being a woman, because she is completely old and she doesn't really have control over her senses or control over her memory in a way that is rational in quality. So in a sense, both of them are liminal characters. Both of them are characters who are sort of passing through a transition phase between two different phases of womanhood. And that kind of transition between phases of womanhood become very important in this particular story, in a sense, in ways that connect the two characters in existential and experiential manners. So we are told, and like I said, the household setting, the household space becomes a very important issue in this particular story, because not least because that space is mapped discursively in terms of how the rooms are situated, in terms of how the functioning happens in the house, etc. And also the whole idea of the inadequate male is an important issue, which keeps coming up in the story. The male who is not quite adequate, is not quite powerful, is not quite strong, and that becomes a marker of this household in a way. So there's a degree of masculinity crisis in the story, which is sort of subterranean, but it's very much there. So, and then this whole reference to a young doctor who comes to and checks Rukmini is very symbolic in quality. The young doctor comes with a young medical gaze, which is completely insufficient, inadequate in terms of matching up to the experiential and existential content that Rukmini carries, that Rukmini embodies. That embodiment obviously becomes, far surpasses the gaze of the young doctor in terms of training, in terms of knowledge. Okay, so we see, he sort of happens to get frustrated, he happens to get a bit restless looking at Rukmini, and then of course he declares that this is something which is almost fatal, this is something which cannot be cured, so we may as well keep her in the house. Okay, so in a way, so that becomes a marker of a certain kind of identity. The identity about womanhood, the identity about incurability, which is there in the story as well. Okay, so and then we are told when the doctor left, this should be on the screen, when the doctor left, we looked at each other, the three of us, like shifty accomplices. My mother, practical as always, broke the silence and said, "Let's not tell her anything. Why worry her? And then we'll have all kinds of difficult old aunts and cousins visiting. It'll be such a nuisance. How will Ratna study in the middle of all that chaos?" So Ratna, of course, happens to be the protagonist and the narrator figure in the story, who is studying to be a doctor. Okay, but when I went to our room that night, my great-grandmother had a sly look on her face. So the sly look becomes important over here, because that slyness will then become subversive in quality in terms of the things she begins to do, in terms of the food she begins to eat, as acts of subversion, as markers of subversion in a way. My great-grandmother had a sly look on her face. "Come here, Ratna," she said. "Come here, my darling little gem." I went, my heart quaking at the thought of telling her. She held my hand and kissed each finger, her half-closed eyes almost flirtatious. So again, look at the quasi-erotic quality. in this conversation. So sly, flirtatious. So all these adjectives become, they tell you something in terms of what the character is becoming. Tell me something right now. She began in a wheedling voice. I don't know anything about it, I said quickly. Of course I do. She was surprised, a little annoyed. Those small cakes you got from the Christian shop that day, do they have eggs in them? Do they? She persisted. Will you? And her eyes narrowed with cunning. Will you get one for me? Now, this is a point in the story where, consumption begins to become subversion, right? So she tells, of course, there's a bit of a miscommunication over here. Ratna thinks that she's about to ask her about a medical condition, but, Rukmini couldn't care less about a medical condition. What she cares about is the fact that the cakes she had from a certain Christian shop the other day, again, the location of the Christian shop is important. The Christian shop is outside the parameters and the moral parameters of consumption of this particular house, which happens to be a Tamil Brahmin house, which is completely vegetarian, and there's no non-vegetarian item. Even a cake made with eggs is a strict taboo in this particular house. Now, what happens in the story, what begins to happen in the story, is that this very old great-grandmother who had lived presumably her entire life as an embodiment of these taboos, as an embodiment of these moral parameters, that she begins to become subversive. So she now is quizzing Ratna about the egg cakes that she got from the Christian shop that day, and she wants her to bring one for her. And she tells her quite clearly, will you get one for me? And then we are told, so we began a strange partnership, my great-grandmother and I. So partnership becomes an important word over here. They almost become colluders with each other. They collude with each other in terms of what they want to do. So the great-grandmother and Ratna, they begin to become partners, accomplices in kind of activity. And what kind of activity were those? What kinds of activity were those? I smuggled cakes and ice cream, biscuits and samosas made by non-Brahmin hands into a vegetarian invalid's room. So that one sentence, getting cakes and ice cream and biscuits and samosas made by non-Brahmin hands. So again, the whole idea, the whole issue of hygiene becomes very important over here, in a sense that the hygiene is obviously equated with morality, equated with a certain kind of consumption, with a certain cultural consumption, and that becomes that begins to get subverted. So she begins to get more and more food made by non-Brahmins, and that becomes an issue. That becomes an enactment of a certain kind of subversion. And of course, the location of subversion is very important, because she's doing that simply by staying in a room, an invalid's room, a vegetarian invalid's room, a Brahmin vegetarian invalid's room, inside the house. But the act of subversion happens through consumption. The fact that she's eating these things, samosas, ice creams, cakes, biscuits made by non-Brahmins, that immediately becomes something in a way which is subversive in quality. To the deathbed of a Brahmin widow who had never eaten anything but pure home-cooked food for almost a century, right? So it almost becomes a bit of a paradigm shift in a way, that for almost a century she hadn't touched anything which is not homemade, which is not pure, which is not moral and hygienic in quality. But now she finds herself eating all kinds of food, and that becomes an important activity. She would grab it from my hand late at night after my parents had gone to sleep. She would hold the pastry in her fingers, turn it round and round as if on the verge of an earth-shaking discovery. So this becomes very deeply experiential to her. It's not just eating food, it's about experiencing a certain kind of sensation which is subversive. She knows that she's breaking the rules, she knows that she's breaking the taboo in this particular case by eating certain kinds of food, but that becomes exciting for her. And so all the other adjectives, flirtatious, cunning, sly, all these add together to make, to define, to inform this activity as some certain kind of activity over here. Okay? And then she asks this question, does it really have an egg in it? She would ask again, as if she needed the password for her to bite into it with her gums, right? So the fact that it needs to have an egg in it, and that discovery, that knowledge becomes important for her, because that knowledge will allow her to be subversive. That knowledge will allow her to savor this experience more fully. And she said, does it really have an egg in it? She'd ask again, as if she needed the password for her to bite into it with her gums. Yes, I would say, a little tired of midnight feast by then. The pastries were a cheap yellow color, topped by white frosting with hard grey pearls. So these are very cheap pastries, as you can understand. Cheap yellow color, topped by white frosting, so not very good frosting, and hard grey pearls. So not expensive pastries at all. But that's the whole point. The point is she's having cheap pastries made in local bazaars, made by non-Brahmins, and that becomes sort of unhygienic food. And of course, hygiene and morality are very carefully equated with each other, especially in this kind of moral map. And the fact that she's eating those kind of food, that becomes important for her, and she keeps quizzing Ratna about the impurity of this food, the desired impurity in this kind of food. So we can see that Ratna's getting tired of the midnight feast, but then, and all these eating activities take place at midnight, which makes it even more clandestine in quality, secretive in quality, and that clandestine quality, that secretive quality, adds to the subversive quotient that this particular activity has. So he keeps asking Ratna whether or not these have eggs in it, eggs in them. Lots and lots of eggs, I would say, wanting her to hurry up and put it in her mouth. And the bakery is owned by a Christian. I think the highest Muslim cooks do. So if you can see, the bakery is owned by a Christian, and they have Muslim cooks, and they are making cakes which have eggs in them. So all these add together. So she's trying to dramatize the departure from the kind of moral map that Rukmini has always been located in. She's trying to accentuate the subversion by sort of adding on the different boxes. So it's owned by a Christian, it's cooked by a Muslim, it's got eggs in it. So all these things make the departure even more dramatic in quality, make the subversion even more dramatic in quality, more complete in quality, in a sense. So, far from the home-cooked vegetarian meals that she had been allowed to have for almost a century as a Tamil Brahmin widow in this particular case. She would moan. Her little pink tongue darted out and licked the frosting. So this is very, very erotic, as you can see. It's almost like an erotic adventure for her, having these egg cakes at midnight with the knowledge that they come from a Christian shop and made by Muslim bakers. So she would moan in ecstasy, she would moan in happiness and sort of subversive ecstasy. Her little pink tongue darted out and licked the frosting. Her toothless mouth worked its way steadily, munching, making happy, sucking noises. Our secret was safe for about a week, then she became bold. She was bored with the cakes, she said. They gave her heartburn. She became a little more adventurous every day. Her cravings were various and unpredictable, laughable and always urgent. Right? So the adjectives are very important over here. So we are told that she was happy with cakes for 1 week, but then she wanted more, then she wanted to sort of extend her subversion. But if you look at the way that she was eating the cakes, walked its way steadily, munching, making happy, sucking noises, again, very erotic in qualities. It's almost become sexual subversion in a certain sense. And then we are told that she was bored with the cakes and they gave her heartburn, she said, and she wanted to be more adventurous. Her cravings were various and unpredictable, laughable and always urgent. So, all kinds of cravings began to happen at this point of time. And again, they studied the consistent narrative across his cravings was the fact that she always wanted something which is impure, quote unquote impure, from the bazaar, from outside the home, made by impure hands, made by non-Brahmin hands, made by Muslim and Christian hands. So that, in her knowledge system, that would be impure, right? Because she was born and brought up in that kind of a knowledge system, and that knowledge system always told her that any food which is cooked outside the home, any food which is made by non-Brahmins, is always impure by default. And now she's craving for the impurity. Actually, she's craving for the dirt from the bazaar towards the last leg, leg of her life. That she wants a sort of food which comes from the outside, or which has got nothing to do with the purity of the homemade food. "I'm thirsty," she moaned when my mother asked her if she wanted anything. No, I don't want water. I don't want juice." She stopped the moaning and looked at my mother's patient, exasperated face. "I'll tell you what I want," she whined. "Give me a glass of that brown drink Ratna bought in the bottle, the kind that bubbles and makes a popping sound when you open the bottle, the one with the tizzy noise when you pour it out." So she wants a fizzy, cold drink. She wants a Coca-Cola, for instance, and presumably. And again, that foreignness of the drink is important. That aspiration for that taste is important, because that becomes, in a way, a very experiential thing. That becomes an affective adventure for her. She wants that effect to sort of get that effect, acquire that effect by consuming a certain kind of food, a certain kind of beverage over here. She doesn't want water. She doesn't want homemade juice. She wants that, that fizzy drink that Ratna, the great-granddaughter, bought in a bottle. She's noticed it and she wants it. "Right, a Coca-Cola?" said my mother. "Shocked. Don't be silly. It'll make you sick." "I don't care what it is called," my great-grandmother said, and started moaning again. "I want it." So again, the craving for something which is outside the home, the craving for something which is outside the moral parameter, the moral map, becomes very symbolic over here, in a sense that it makes up, the whole aspirational quality, the whole aspirational quotient becomes important over here. And that is obviously connected to the subversive quotient that she happens to be enacting, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps unintentionally. But the experientiality is the most important thing. And again, what we're looking here is a very interesting combination, a very interesting entanglement between experientiality and discursivity, because this experience are also discursive in quality, in the sense that she's craving for food which is outside her home. She wants to have food which is sort of non-hygienic in quality, and that is almost making a statement. That's almost telling herself that she is adventuring, she is experiencing an adventure which is quite exciting in quality. So she got it. My mother poured out a small glassful, tight-lipped, and gave it to her without a word. She was always a dutiful great daughter-in-law. Ah, sighed my great-grandmother, propped up against the pillows, the steel tumbler lifted high over her lips. So if you visualize this image, she's having Coca-Cola and a steel tumbler. And that image, again, this is very interesting, because this is why we can apply something like thing theory very effectively. So it's a thing, it's a marker, a certain kind of, it's a container for something, but it becomes metaphorical, it becomes quite iconic over here. The steel tumbler is something with which someone of her situation would drink from, whether it's water or juice or something like that. But what she's doing is she's pouring Coca-Cola into it, into the steel tumbler of a Brahmin household. And that steel tumbler then becomes, it opens up as a vessel, it opens up as a thing. It begins to acquire new markers of subversion, new markers of identity, new markers of functionality. So no longer is it a container, a tumbler for containing water or any homemade beverage. It's now containing Coca-Cola, which she's sipping, the great-grandmother, in a very, very satisfactory and very satisfied fashion. The lump on her neck moved in little gurgles as she drank. Then she burped a loud, contented burp and asked, as if she had just thought of it, "Do you think there is something in it, alcohol?" So, look at the dark, humorous way in which the subversion is proceeding or extending, beyond, the familiar parameters. So she had originally thought, she'd originally wanted to have a beverage, a normal beverage. She's seen a beverage which is from the bazaar, and she wanted that cold beverage, a fizzy beverage. And now when she's had it, she's asking, or she's sort of wishing or hoping that it contains alcohol in it, which will complete or accentuate the subversive activity that she is enacting at this point in time. And I do think there's something in it, alcohol. A month later, we had got used to her new, unexpected, inappropriate demands. She had tasted by now lemon tarts, garlic, 3 types of aerated drinks, fruitcake laced with brandy, a bhelpuri from the fly-infested bazaar nearby. So again, the fly-infested bazaar becomes very, very important, because that becomes the marker, that becomes a very iconic symbol of non-hygienic space. Fly-infested bazaar is as far from home as possible, as far from the purity and hygiene of home as possible. And she's had all kinds of food, lemon tarts, garlic, different kinds of aerated drink, fruit cakes laced with brandy, which is again almost, she's almost consuming alcohol now, and bhelpuri from the fly-infested bazaar. So if you take all these things together, these become markers of certain kind of consumption which is non-hygienic in quality, consumption which is impure in quality, and the impurity, the non-hygienic quality becomes part of the, like I said, part of the experience of this adventurous consumption or affective adventure that she's having or happening to have at this point in time in her life. There's going to be trouble, my mother kept muttering under her breath. She's losing her mind, she's going to be a lot of trouble. And she was right, of course. My great-grandmother could no longer swallow very well. She would pour the cork into her mouth, and half of it would trickle out of her nostrils, thick, brown, nauseating. So she couldn't even drink Coca-Cola anymore, and she would pour it in her mouth, and it will come out, it will spill over, it will spill out of her nostrils in a very nauseating sight. Thick, brown, nauseating. It burns, she would yell then, but she pursed her lips tightly together when my mother spooned a thin gruel into her mouth. No, she screamed deliriously. Get me something from the bazaar, raw onions, fried bread, chickens and goats. Now she wants chicken and mutton, and this becomes an ecstasy for her. This becomes almost like a psychedelic experience for her. And that psychedelic experience is part of subversion in a way. And she's demanding that she has non-vegetarian food. She's demanding to have fried bread, raw onions, chickens and mutton from the bazaar. And this, coming from a very typically conservative Tamil Brahmin household, becomes a very, very symbolic act, becomes a very symbolic desire. And obviously I would use the word desire in all its connotations, because there is an erotic quality about this consumption, as we have said. The word mourn keeps coming up. The visceral pleasure and experience in this kind of food becomes very important as well. And also, it's part of discursive mapping. So, this is a very old Brahmin widow who had been subjugated to a certain kind of moral parameters all her life. And that subjugation is now coming to an end, because her life is coming to an end effectively. And now she demands to have different kinds of food. And the food becomes, like I mentioned, the food becomes markers of subversion, markers of identity, markers of appropriation in a certain sense. And of course, the appropriation is quite visceral in quality. But what's interesting for us as students of feminist writings and culture studies is how the viscerality of this consumption is quite discursive in quality. So there's a commonality between, there's a mapping to be done between viscerality and discursivity, which is what the story is all about. Then we knew she was lost to us, she was dying. She was in a nursing home for 10 whole days. My mother and I took turns sitting by her, sleeping on the floor by the hospital cot. So now we're told that she was coming to the last phase of her life, the last bit of her life, really, the last league of her life. And then she was dying. And then she was in a hospital bed for 10 days. My mother and I, Ratna's mother and Naretta's mother, and she took turns in terms of sleeping on the floor by the hospital cot. She lay there quietly, the pendulous neck almost as big as her face, but she would not let the nurses near her bed. She would squirm and wriggle like a big fish that refused to be caught. Again, if you look at the metaphor used over here, a big fish that refused to be caught. So again, a non-vegetarian food, allusion to a non-vegetarian food. It's like a big fish that doesn't want to be caught, and that wriggling becomes important over here. That squirming becomes important over here. That becomes an act of resistance to a certain extent. And again, we find that this is a commonality. This is something which we see across texts in this particular course. We saw that in Tulips by Sylvia Plath. We saw that in a yellow wall paper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And we see that again, we saw that to some extent in Jhumpa Lahiri's and Temporary Matter. The location of the female body in a medical space becomes a very important issue throughout this course, throughout the text, different texts that we did in this course. And we find that there's always an act of resistance, there's always an act of unhappiness, an unhappy negotiation with the medical space, which is almost always very male in quality, which is almost very sort of phallogocentric in quality. And that phallogocentricity of the medical space is situated, is pitted against the experientiality of the female body, the experientiality of the female experience, of the female life, or the life narrative. And the two are pitted against each other, and the two are sort of in conflict with each other in a certain sense. So this whole idea of wriggling and squirming becomes important in this particular context. The sheet smelled, and the young doctor shook his head. Not much to be done now, he said. The cancer has left nothing intact. So the cancer, again, that too becomes an act of consumption. So she is sort of, it's almost like an auto-cannibalistic quality about auto-consumptive quality, auto-cannibalistic quality about herself, where she's almost eating herself up. The cancer is eating her up. And that, in a way, one can read this as her act of eating foreign food, her act of eating exotic food, her act of eating non-hygienic, immoral food becomes, in a way, a resistance to cancer. Cancer which is eating her body. So that act of eating bhelpuri and samosas and cakes with eggs, aerated drinks, that becomes a desperate resistance, a desperate retaliation against cancer, against being eaten up. So it all becomes very consumptive in quality. The different orders of consumption happening over here. And like you mentioned, the whole idea of the Brahmin widow eating out or demanding to eat food from the bazaar becomes very subversive in quality, becomes almost a retaliation to a certain extent. And the young doctor, so again, the young doctor is important, the youngness of the doctor, the youth of the doctor is important, because that keeps telling us, in a sense that, this is a young man and the young man's medical knowledge is pitted against this old woman's experience of femininity, the old woman's experience of morality, the old woman's experience of subversion. And so that becomes a very interesting dialogue to a certain extent. So the young doctor keeps shaking his head. Not much to be done now, he said. The cancer has left nothing intact. So, this is the point where they get to know, everyone gets to know that she's about to die, and everyone gets to know that the act of consumption is now complete. So the cancer has eaten her up effectively, and the act of being eaten up becomes a very, very sort of visceral thing, of course. But that's also part of the discursive thing, because then she also ensures that she eats food from the outside. She eats things such as bhel puri and samosas and Coca-Cola and all the other kinds of food from the bazaar. A sort of fly-infested bazaar is a very important space in the story, because that's a complete ontological opposite of the pure Brahmin household, where everything is mapped and hygienically maintained. So that becomes a very important spatial counterpoint to the home. So it's almost like an uncanny outside the home to a certain extent. And we saw, again, the whole idea of being outside the home becomes a very important issue in this course, especially if you think of a text such as Goblin Market, which is entirely about the uncanniness of being outside the home, the danger of the uncanny, the danger of being seduced by the uncanny. That becomes very important in that particular poem as well. So, that's the reason why I've been very careful in terms of selecting the text in this course, because there are several issues which run across the text, or with several themes which run across the text, which is something which we must pay very careful attention to. Okay, so I stop at this point today, and we'll conclude this text in the next lecture, which will be a shorter lecture, but we'll finish the story and we'll wind up with certain issues which I've already covered, but we'll take a look at it retrospectively, which will help us get a fuller view of what the story is all about. So I'll see you in the next lecture, where we conclude this particular short story, Remains of the Feast. Thank you for your attention.